John Rockefeller is an outstanding businessman who built an empire by an effort of will. He became the first dollar billionaire of all time. His hard work and entrepreneurial intuition were the foundation of the American dream. He is still considered one of the richest men in history. Today, his personal fortune would reach more than $500 billion. In fact, it is more than Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Mark Zuckerberg put together. This is the first time in American history that not a politician was able to lead an entire nation. Instead, he was an ordinary man from a simple family. John Rockefeller grew up in a poor family. Since childhood, he wished to achieve more, dreamed of great things, and knew it would not happen to him without effort. Since childhood, he showed his entrepreneurial skills. He sold sweets to schoolchildren and caught wild turkeys, then fattened them up and sold them to neighbors. Rockefeller started his career at the age of 16 as an accountant's assistant in a small company with a salary of 50 cents a day. He worked so hard that the owner of the company had to send him home and insist on lunch breaks. A year later, his salary had tripled. The owner of the company immediately discerned him as a talented manager and offered him the position of company manager. However, Rockefeller decided not to accept the position and chose to leave the company to start his firm. Together with Morris Clark, he opens his first firm. The company dealt with the trade of pork, grain, and other commodities. Because of Rockefeller's accounting skills, the company grew steadily. In just 2 years, the company's profit grew to such an extent that the partners wondered where else to invest. At that time, the oil industry was rapidly developing in America. They extracted crude oil from the ground and refined it into kerosene. This inexpensive and safe source of light significantly changed people's way of life. Before kerosene, people had no access to an inexpensive source of light. As the sun went down, there was always darkness, and kerosene was the miracle that changed the world. Rockefeller decided to invest in it and realized that oil can change the entire world economy and bring him fabulous wealth. However, well drilling was a risky business. You could drill a well, and it would turn out to be dry. And even if not, you could still lose half the oil. He was not happy with that, and he decided to find a way to make money without any risk. Because of Rockefeller's forward thinking, he was a step ahead of his competitors. While others would do the risky process of extraction, he would refine it. Therefore, Rockefeller invested his entire fortune, about $4,000, into the construction of a small oil refinery. At that time, there were thousands of small firms operating in the oil industry. Although the competition was fierce, Rockefeller noticed that the whole oil business was organized inefficiently and chaotically. In order to succeed in it, he understood that he should create a separate infrastructure and make sure that his company was as independent. It was necessary to find a way to produce more kerosene. It was a daunting task. However, Rockefeller had spent his whole life struggling with difficulties. Therefore, he collaborated with a talented chemist, Samuel Andrews, who invented a new way to refine oil. Rockefeller had to expand his business, so he brought in investors to set up the Standard Oil Company. He made the production as waste-free as possible, while others were wasting up to 50% of the oil. Rockefeller managed to get more kerosene out of crude and set up a trade with paraffin, fuel oil, and petroleum jelly as successful refinery products. As a result, Rockefeller was able to negotiate a significant discount on oil transportation with one of the railroad magnates. Thus, kerosene became the most demanded product in the country, arousing the interest of many investors. However, that was not enough for Rockefeller. He realized that every train going through America could transport his kerosene. Although he could barely keep up with the demand before, now there was too much oil that there were not enough trains left. Therefore, he agreed to collaborate with another rival railroad company on better terms. Rockefeller manipulated the interests of the railroads very skillfully. He played off the two competing companies against each other in order to maximize benefits for himself. Once Rockefeller managed to set up the railroads, he supplied almost every house with his own kerosene in the U.S. However, the uncontrolled production of oil caused the supply in the market to exceed the demand in the whole country, which resulted in a sharp collapse in oil prices. During such a difficult time for the market, Rockefeller began to act decisively. He began to buy competitors. Due to low oil prices, many firms went bankrupt, and Rockefeller was buying them up at a ridiculous price. Therefore, firms had to choose between joining him and bankruptcy. The majority of them preferred to join Standard Oil in return for a share of the stock. Once the oil price goes down, nothing would cause us to give up buying the companies, he said. In contrast to others, when the market goes down, we should act, not panic. He was not going to expand the business. He wanted to maximize profits without regard for anyone else. His plan was simple, taking over the entire U.S. oil infrastructure. However, even then this goal seemed elusive. By that time, he owned only 5% of America's oil production. Over time, dissatisfaction from the railroad companies began to grow. They began to realize that there was only one way to oppose Rockefeller, to create a unified railroad cartel. Tom Scott was president of a major railroad company. He made an alliance with his most dangerous competitor. Along with him, they wanted to put Rockefeller out of business. They raised the price of shipping oil for their biggest customer. Rockefeller took this as a declaration of war. Rockefeller looked for new ways to transport oil. He knew that otherwise he would not be able to win the war, and he found an unexpected solution. At the factory, he saw how the oil was transported through large pipes. He realized that if he managed to build a long pipeline, he would deal a major blow to the entire railroad infrastructure. However, this construction required an enormous investment, but if everything worked out well, he would no longer be dependent on the whims of the railroad companies. Every day the work was going on, without even a break in the night. The total length of the entire pipeline exceeded 6,000 kilometers, bringing oil from thousands of wells directly to the Rockefeller factories. It was a hard blow for the railroad companies. Their stock collapsed. Investors lost a huge amount of money. Indeed, 40% of the loading of the railroads was for the transportation of oil to Rockefeller. 1/3 of the 360 railroad companies went bankrupt. It was a crushing blow to the economy. The country fell into a severe depression, which had never happened before. It destroyed the small business. Moreover, Rockefeller continued to buy up his competitors. He bought up many companies at a ridiculous price. Thus, by the end of the Depression, Rockefeller had created the largest empire in the United States. However, his main rival, railroad magnate Tom Scott, was able to survive the crisis. He wanted to take full revenge on Rockefeller and made a crazy decision to break into the oil refining industry. He developed an aggressive plan, expecting to acquire some of the remaining small oil producers. He planned to increase industrial capacity and built his pipeline. He was confident that only his trains could bring oil to Pittsburgh, where Rockefeller's pipeline did not reach. Scott was sure that it would help resist Rockefeller. However, Rockefeller was not going to measure up to the situation. He went to negotiate with Scott, but not from the position of a man who was looking for a compromise, but as the owner of the situation. Scott was reminded of who was carrying most of the oil products on the company lines and told to back off. However, Scott refused, knowing that only his railroad ran from Pittsburgh to New York. Rockefeller made the hard decision to close all the factories in Pittsburgh. Closing the factories caused a huge loss for the Standard Oil Company. But the important thing for Rockefeller was to destroy his competitor. To prevent the company from going bankrupt right away, Scott had to lay off thousands of workers and cut wages for the rest. The workers took to the streets in protest, and as the night came, all of Tom Scott's railroad structures and thousands of railroad cars were burned in the city. Consequently, his company was in ruins. As a result, within 10 years, Standard Oil's share increased from 5% to 90%. 6,000 kilometers of pipeline were built, 20,000 wells and more than 100,000 employees worked in his corporation. Rockefeller became the richest man in America. His net worth was estimated at $150 million. At today's rate, it is about $200 billion. In America, everyone hated Standard Oil more than anyone else did. The company was the personification of evil and big money. In September 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became president and immediately launched an antitrust campaign against the nation's largest corporations. The government sued Standard Oil, and it became the largest trial in history. The trial lasted several years, and in 1911, the authorities finally declared that Rockefeller's company should be disbanded and divided into 34 independent companies. The most interesting thing is that even though Rockefeller lost the Standard Oil Company, his fortune continued to grow. After all, he owned a controlling interest in all of the reformed companies. When these companies competed, their shares skyrocketed in value, which made Rockefeller the first billionaire in the history of the United States. By the end of his life, his fortune stood at about $1.5 billion US. In current calculations, his fortune would have reached up to $500 billion. Rockefeller began his charity work at the age of 16. He constantly donated 10% of his income to churches, even when he earned $16 a month. Moreover, after he retired, Rockefeller began donating to education, medicine, and the arts. He donated huge amounts of money to universities and religious institutions. The charitable foundation that he founded, even after his death, was donating huge amounts of money to public health needs. John Rockefeller lived until he was 97 years old and donated more than $100 billion to charity. Who was he then? John Rockefeller, the personification of evil on earth, or a genius entrepreneur? Write your opinion in the comments.